12th of January, 1945. Wittstock, Germany. Snow drifted through the smoke of a dying city. On the edge of the town, inside the burned-out shell of a machine factory, a lone German sniper prepared for what he knew would be his final stand. His name was Erich Meyer, corporal of the 2nd Panzer Grenadier Division. His rifle, a Mauser 98K with a cracked Zeiss scope, was the only thing still in order. He cleaned it by touch, checked the bolt twice, and positioned himself above a narrow cobblestone street that led into the Soviet approach. He was out of food, nearly out of ammunition, but his mind was sharper than ever. The Red Army had reached the outskirts before dawn. Their scouts moved through alleys, their helmets ghostly under snow. From his perch, Meyer studied their rhythm, the way they advanced in short bursts, the pauses, the gestures of officers counting windows. It was a pattern, predictable as machinery. He decided to break it not with bullets, but with imagination. If they believed the street was held by many, they would stop. If they stopped, he could buy time. He fired once. A Soviet point man dropped. The patrol scattered. He waited until they regrouped, then fired again from a different corner. The echo bounced off the walls, multiplied by the ruins. The soldiers thought there were two shooters. He crawled across broken concrete, dragging debris to create footprints in opposite directions. He hung shards of glass on wires so sunlight would flash like a second rifle scope. Every detail became a decoy. Every silence became a threat. By mid-morning, Soviet commanders radioed that multiple snipers were covering the street. They halted the advance, called for artillery, and began scanning windows through binoculars. Meyer watched them freeze under his invisible network of traps. He had only 9 rounds left, yet it no longer mattered. The illusion was the weapon. When night came, he used the last light to move a fallen body into the open and prop its rifle against a wall. In the moonglow, it looked alive, guarding the entrance. He positioned himself behind it and waited. The Red Army, seeing the silhouette, assumed the defenders were rotating shifts. They prepared for an assault at dawn. Inside the freezing shell of the factory, Meyer ate a handful of snow and whispered the rhythm of his breathing to steady his hands. He was one man pretending to be a platoon, a craftsman building fear out of sound and shadow. Outside, the street lay empty, untouched. No tank moved forward. No soldier dared to cross. In that stillness, a single sniper held an entire world at gunpoint. Dawn came slowly over Wittstock, dim and colorless, turning the snow to dull silver. In the still air, every sound carried. The Russians returned before sunrise, crawling low between craters, scanning the buildings for movement. They were certain the street hit a fortified German position. They whispered of tripwires and crossfire, of a full sniper detachment entrenched inside the ruins. None of them knew there was only one man behind the illusion. From the shattered upper floor of the factory, Erich Meyer adjusted his cracked scope. His eyes ached from the cold, but he knew the distances by heart. He had spent the night setting up his trick, a system of mirrors, ropes, and decoys that turned his single position into a phantom network. When he pulled a wire tied to a hanging metal sheet, the sound mimicked a second shot echoing from a rooftop. When the wind shifted, it rattled a line of empty cans, sounding like movement from another floor. To the soldiers below, it would seem like the building was alive with snipers. He waited until the first squad moved into view. 5 men crossed the open street. He fired once. The first fell. The rest dropped to the ground, scanning the windows, shouting to unseen enemies. Meyer crawled backward, dragging his rifle to a new hole in the wall, and triggered a second sound using the wire. The echo rang from the opposite side of the block. The Soviets returned fire, wasting entire magazines on shadows. Within minutes, the advance stopped. Commanders radioed for smoke cover. A mortar team deployed, lobbing shells toward what they thought were nests of shooters. Each explosion tore more holes in the ruins, filling the air with dust and snow. But Meyer stayed low, breathing through his sleeve, invisible. He fired only 3 more times that morning. Each bullet found a target. Each pause between them convinced the enemy there were still many rifles waiting. The Soviet attack dissolved into confusion. Reports came in claiming 4 or more German snipers, possible machine gun fire, well-coordinated ambush. None of it was true. The only coordination was inside Meyer's head, a rhythm of patience and deception. He had turned empty buildings into accomplices. By midday, the Soviets halted all movement in the sector. Tanks were ordered to wait for air support. Infantry regrouped behind barricades, unwilling to cross. A single street, 200 meters long, had become a dead zone. For the first time since the Eastern Offensive began, an entire Soviet battalion had lost momentum to one man. Inside the factory, Meyer's hands trembled. His ammunition was down to 5 rounds. His food was gone. The heat from his last match had long faded. Yet the illusion still worked. The Russians could not see him, and that blindness gave him power. Night fell again, thick and silent. Snow drifted through holes in the ceiling, dusting the dead body he had propped by the doorway. Its helmet gleamed faintly in moonlight. Meyer sat in the dark beside it, rifle across his knees, listening to the wind whistle through broken pipes. Outside, 2 armies waited for dawn, neither willing to move. He had become what every soldier feared most, a single unseen eye that never slept. The second morning began with artillery. Soviet guns on the outskirts of Wittstock opened fire just after sunrise, pounding the northern quarter with shells meant to erase whatever defenders still lingered. The street vanished in smoke and white dust. For nearly an hour the ground trembled, windows shattered and walls folded inward like paper. When the barrage ended, silence fell again. The soldiers waited for a counterattack that never came. Beneath the rubble, Erich Meyer still breathed. He had pressed himself beneath a collapsed beam, face streaked with ash, rifle clutched against his chest. The factory above him was unrecognizable, only fragments of staircases and twisted girders. He moved slowly, clearing debris from his line of sight, and found his decoys gone. His traps were destroyed, his mirrors shattered. The illusion had to be rebuilt from nothing. He scavenged through the wreckage, piecing together what the bombardment had left him. A broken shutter became a reflective surface. A tattered curtain served as a smokescreen. A rusted gear, when rolled down a metal pipe, mimicked the echo of a second rifle shot. Each sound mattered more than bullets. The enemy didn't have to die to be stopped. They only had to believe they were already surrounded. By noon, Soviet patrols crept forward again. They moved cautiously, bayonets fixed, rifles raised at every shadow. Meyer watched them through the dust, his pulse steady, his breath shallow. When the first soldier stepped into the open, Meyer fired. The man dropped instantly. Before the rest could react, he struck a hanging wire. The metallic rattle sounded like fire from the upper floor. The Soviets dove for cover, returning fire in every direction. Smoke grenades filled the air. Machine guns sprayed the facades. The illusion was complete once more. From the outside, it looked like coordinated defense from multiple shooters. Inside, there was only Meyer. One man crawling through debris, his boots bleeding through torn soles, his knuckles split from the cold. He had 4 rounds left. By mid-afternoon, Soviet command ordered the advance to stop. Reports claimed that at least 8 enemy snipers held the block, possibly supported by a machine gun hidden in the ruins. Officers argued about flanking or waiting for armor. They didn't realize they were debating a ghost. As dusk fell, Meyer climbed higher into the broken skeleton of the factory to see beyond the smoke. He could make out Soviet medics dragging bodies away and engineers setting up spotlights to scan the windows. The light swept past him once, twice, then stopped. He didn't move. When it passed again, he squeezed the trigger, breaking the beam's operator before the crew even understood where the shot came from. The spotlights died. The street fell back into darkness. The Soviets retreated to regroup for the night. Meyer leaned against a wall exhausted, his vision swimming. The cold was deep enough to burn. He had turned his surroundings into weapons, but his body was failing. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His fingers barely felt the trigger. He looked down at the rifle. The metal gleamed faintly in the dark. Every dent and scratch told the story of how long he'd lasted, how many times he'd reimagined death into survival. He had held a street for nearly 48 hours. No reinforcements, no orders, only instinct and deception. Outside, the snow fell again, soft and endless, covering bodies, footprints, and broken glass, erasing the day as if it had never happened. The third day began under a frozen sky. The smoke from burned-out houses had thinned, drifting like fog through the ruins. Wittstock was quiet except for the creak of ice and the distant rumble of artillery far to the east. The street where Erich Meyer had made his stand was still untouched. The Soviets called it the Corridor of Death. No one wanted to cross it. At first light, Meyer awoke to the sound of boots crunching snow. He had dozed off for only minutes, half buried under rubble, rifle across his chest. His joints were stiff, his lips cracked, his breath barely visible in the cold. He had 3 bullets left. The skin of his fingers had split open from frostbite. Every movement was pain, but he forced himself to crawl toward the light. Through the shattered wall, he saw a new formation. Soviet infantry moving in from both sides. They had decided to end it today. Smoke shells burst along the street, blinding the view. Tanks idled at the far end, waiting for clearance. Meyer steadied the rifle. He no longer cared about surviving. His world had narrowed to the distance between his scope and the first silhouette that appeared in it. He fired once. The echo tore through the smoke. He shifted, rolled behind a beam, and triggered another noise. A hollow clang of metal that mimicked a second sniper shot. The Soviets ducked and fired wildly into empty windows. He waited. Another squad emerged from the mist, crawling forward with bayonets. He fired again, and again. The same echo followed from his decoy. 3 shots, 3 bodies, and the illusion held. The Russians answered with mortars. The factory shook, walls collapsing in waves. Shards of ice and glass rained over him. He pressed against the floor, covering his head as dust filled his mouth and lungs. When the bombardment stopped, he couldn't hear. His world was muffled, pulsing with the slow rhythm of his heartbeat. He tasted blood but kept the rifle steady. Hours passed before the next attempt came. A lone Soviet soldier, cautious and desperate, crawled through the snow toward the building's base. Meyer watched through his cracked scope, barely breathing. The man was young, no older than 20. For a long moment, Meyer didn't fire. The boy moved closer, rifle shaking in his hands. Then a gust of wind blew open a hanging door behind Meyer, and the soldier froze. Their eyes met across the distance, one filled with fear, the other empty. Meyer finally pulled the trigger. The echo rolled down the street, bouncing between ruins. The Red Army halted once again. They thought the defenders were still alive, still waiting. By now it was late afternoon. The light dimmed, the snow began to fall heavier, and the street vanished into a pale haze. Inside the ruins, Meyer slumped against a wall. His rifle rested beside him. He had no ammunition left. His hands were too cold to close into fists. He had held the street for 72 hours, long enough for his name to fade even before his body did. When Soviet troops finally advanced at nightfall, they found nothing moving. Only one body in the factory, one rifle, and hundreds of spent shells scattered across the road. They counted the bullet holes and shook their heads. No one could explain how one man had created the sound of an army. The next morning, officers marked the block on their maps as secured. They never wrote his name. The official report listed multiple enemy snipers neutralized. But among the men who had been there, the story was passed down quietly. A single German marksman who made an entire street stand still for 3 days. Long after the snow melted, the soldiers who survived still remembered the sound. One rifle echoing again and again until it felt like the whole town was breathing through a single trigger. When the street finally fell silent, the Red Army advanced carefully, step by step, rifles raised toward the windows. The air still carried the faint smell of gunpowder and burnt plaster. Each corner looked alive, as if another shot might come from any direction. It took hours for them to believe it was over. The soldiers found the sniper slumped near a collapsed wall, his rifle across his knees, his face turned toward the street he had held. There were no medals, no maps, no identification tags. Only the blackened metal of the weapon and the prints of boots that had moved back and forth in a dozen false directions. They searched the ruins for other shooters. None existed. The discovery unsettled them more than the fighting had. One soldier said later that it felt like entering the mind of a ghost. They collected the rifle, covered the body with a torn blanket, and moved on. The war was still raging, and this frozen street was just one of countless ruins between them and Berlin. Yet as the men left, they looked back once, uneasy. The silence behind them felt deliberate, as if the street itself had learned to wait. In the days that followed, word spread through the regiment about the German who made an army stop. Some dismissed it as superstition, a tale to fill the long nights of marching. Others swore it was true, that one man's trick had delayed the advance by 3 full days. Reports reached command, and officers examined the pattern of bullet impacts, the timing of attacks, the empty shell casings. The evidence defied logic. The conclusion was reluctantly written: enemy resistance concentrated, estimated strength unknown. It was the official language of disbelief. Weeks later, Wittstock was just another waypoint on a map of victory. The street was cleared, bodies buried, rubble pushed aside. Civilians returned slowly, stepping through the ruins where walls once stood. No one spoke of the battle. No one had seen it. They only found the traces, a spent casing here, a shattered scope there, and wondered how such a small place could have held so much noise. After the war, the event faded into obscurity. The German records for that division ended abruptly in early 1945. No mention of Mayer survived. His family in Leipzig never received confirmation of his death, only a form letter marked missing in action. For years they waited, until waiting became habit, and habit turned to forgetting. The war had swallowed millions. One more name meant little. But the Soviets who had fought in Wittstock carried the memory differently. To them, it was not a victory. It was a puzzle. In their letters home, they described a street that refused to die, a place where every shadow seemed to breathe. They remembered the sound of the rifle, single shots spaced so perfectly that it felt like time itself had been cut into pieces. Some wrote that they could still hear it long after the fighting ended, echoing through their dreams. The sniper they never met became a presence, a story told to new recruits about the danger of underestimating the unseen. "Do not rush what you cannot see," the veteran said. And so the legend of Wittstock began, not as a record in any archive, but as a whisper passed from one soldier to another. As years turned to decades, historians would stumble across fragments: a Soviet field report, a burned map, an unclaimed rifle logged in a British collection. None of it was enough to prove the story, yet every piece pointed to something undeniable: that in a world consumed by total war, one man with a rifle and an impossible idea had stopped the machinery of empire for 3 days. And though the war moved on, though the front lines shifted hundreds of miles west, that narrow German street never quite left the minds of those who saw it. It stood as a reminder that not all battles are measured by victory or surrender, but by the moments when fear itself becomes the weapon. In the spring that followed, the snow melted from Wittstock's roofs, revealing a landscape of scars. The street that had once echoed with gunfire lay quiet, its cobblestones cracked, its buildings skeletal. The factory where Erich Meyer had taken his position still stood, barely, a hollow frame with a collapsed roof and walls scorched black by smoke. Children wandered through it, collecting shell casings as toys. To them, the battle was already fading into myth. But for those who had fought there, forgetting was impossible. Soviet engineers sent to rebuild the area noticed strange details. Bullet impacts formed patterns across the walls. Perfect symmetry, as if multiple shooters had fired from different heights. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became that the angles were wrong for a single position. What they didn't understand was that the shooter had engineered the illusion. The ricochets, the mirror flashes, the echoes had written his trick into the stone itself. In Moscow, a report reached military analysts describing the engagement at Wittstock as a unique case of urban resistance by a numerically insignificant enemy force. It was reviewed by officers studying German defensive tactics. One margin note read simply, "Psychological efficiency beyond measurable scale." The author did not realize how literal that phrase was. Meanwhile, in post-war Germany, Meyer's name dissolved into the silence of defeated archives. The Wehrmacht records had been bombed, his division dissolved before surrender, his identity swallowed by the collapse of the Reich. In Leipzig, his family rebuilt what was left of their home. His mother kept his apprenticeship certificate folded in a drawer, its edges worn smooth from years of being touched and put back. They assumed he was gone, another casualty in a war of numbers. It would take decades for anyone to find out that his story had outlived him. In 1952, a Soviet historian collecting data for a study on battlefield morale stumbled across a footnote in an old after-action report. It mentioned persistent sniper defense on a single street in Wittstock, noting that the effect on troop movement was significant despite minimal enemy presence. The historian, Colonel Yuri Samokhin, marked it for deeper review. He couldn't explain why it fascinated him, perhaps because it defied logic. He began tracing the documents backward: daily logs, weather records, terrain sketches. The same conclusion appeared again and again. One position had delayed an entire regiment. Samokhin filed his findings quietly, labeling them Case W43. He never found the sniper's name, but he wrote that the event illustrated the ability of isolated individuals to project power far beyond their actual strength. That phrase, buried in an academic paper, would later reappear in Cold War military theory. In 1961, a NATO analyst translating captured Soviet research came across Samokhin's file. The Western term became the Wittstock effect, the idea that perception alone could alter the balance of force. It was studied not as heroism, but as a system, how timing, silence, and illusion could hold armies in place longer than bullets ever could. By then, no one remembered Meyer, the machinist who had built the illusion from wire and instinct. His body was gone, the rifle lost, the street rebuilt. Yet through theory and training manuals, his trick had become immortal. What had begun as one man's desperate act was now military science, a lesson extracted from death. And so the ghost of a sniper who never intended to be remembered continued to shape battlefields long after his war ended. Outside Wittstock, in winter, when the fog rolled low and the wind carried through the ruins, locals sometimes said they could still hear it, the faint metallic click of a rifle bolt resetting itself against the cold. By the time Europe began to rebuild, the war had already become a memory of ruins and shadows. Cities were patched together, factories reopened, and nations turned their eyes toward the future. Yet some events resisted erasure. Wittstock was one of them. Not because of the scale of destruction, but because of its impossible calm. Veterans from both sides spoke of that street in hushed tones, calling it cursed, bewitched, or haunted. Others said it was an illusion made real by fear itself. In 1970, a German journalist working on a series about forgotten battles of the Eastern Front rediscovered the Soviet reference to the Wittstock sniper. The file, declassified by then, contained a single black and white photograph, the remains of a burned building, and in the corner, a figure barely visible in the snow. The caption read only, "Neutralized Resistance, January 1945. The journalist, intrigued, began searching for witnesses. He found a few survivors from the 2nd Panzergrenadier Division, old men living quietly in small towns. None had known Meyer personally, but they remembered hearing rumors of a man in the north who stayed behind when everyone else withdrew. One of them, a former radio operator, said he once intercepted a message that night, one holding, street intact, then static, nothing more. The journalist wrote his article and titled it "The Street That Wouldn't Fall." It was published in a small West German newspaper, read by few, but it reignited curiosity. Letters came in from readers, veterans, historians, locals, each with a fragment of the story. One described his father's words about a lone sniper who stopped a battalion. Another sent a map with hand-drawn arrows pointing to the old factory site. Piece by piece, the myth began to regain form. In Moscow, retired Colonel Samokhin heard about the article and reached out through an intermediary. He was old by then, living on the edge of memory himself, but he remembered Case W43. His final letter before his death read, "It was no myth. We saw his work. We could not explain it. Fear made real is stronger than fire." The journalist traveled to Wittstock in winter, walking the rebuilt street. The new houses stood clean and square, their facades modern, their foundations layered over the scars of war. Children played in the snow, unaware of what lay beneath. He stopped at the spot where the factory had once been. Nothing remained but a low concrete wall, half buried in frost. He stood there until evening, listening. The town was silent. He never wrote a follow-up. But the notes he left behind described what he felt. Not reverence, not grief, but a strange sense that the air itself remembered. The fear that had once lived there had not fully left. Years later, historians found his research in an archive box labeled Unverified Accounts. Among the papers was a single photograph of a rifle. A Mauser 98K, rusted, its scope cracked across the glass. No provenance, no markings. Attached was a tag from a Soviet inventory record. Recovered Wittstock sector, 1945. Whether it was Meyer's rifle or another's, no one could say. But the image became iconic, the silent symbol of the story that could never be proven, yet refused to disappear. The Wittstock sniper had become something more than a man. He was a reflection of every unseen hand that shapes history, small, invisible, yet capable of halting giants. Every army after the war studied him without a name. Every strategist borrowed from his shadow. And yet the world moved on, forgetting that behind the theories, behind the psychology and the science, there had once been a single cold morning, a single rifle, and one man who simply refused to move. By the late 1980s, the story of Wittstock was no longer a classified curiosity, but a quiet echo in military literature. It appeared in footnotes, often unnamed. An isolated German sniper delaying Soviet advance, 1945. No heroism, no ideology, just a phenomenon, a case study in human perception under stress. And yet, in the margins of those studies, officers scribbled questions that had no tactical answers. How could one man create paralysis in hundreds? Why did rational soldiers obey irrational fear? In the West, defense analysts began re-examining the case under a new concept: perception warfare. The Wittstock incident became a foundational example, a moment where deception and uncertainty achieved what force could not. Meyer's name still wasn't known, but his invisible design influenced future conflicts. Cold War simulations began to replicate his tactics. Isolated signals, artificial gunfire, sound loops played through hidden speakers to simulate entire platoons. The results mirrored Wittstock. Units stalled, progress slowed, morale fractured. The lesson was universal. Meanwhile, Wittstock itself moved on. The factory site was cleared, paved, forgotten beneath layers of concrete. A supermarket stood where the sniper had once waited. Few locals remembered the battle, and those who did spoke of it like a rumor. Every few winters, when construction unearthed old bullet casings, the town council sent them to a museum, unremarked. The past had become clutter, cleaned away by progress. But memory resists silence. In 1993, a young historian named Lena Bauer from Leipzig University uncovered the Soviet after-action report while studying frontline communication breakdowns. Buried in the pages, she found references to phantom resistance, perceived crossfire, and enemy presence unconfirmed. She traced the document to a forgotten archive near Smolensk and discovered something that others had missed: a single notation in German, handwritten in faded pencil at the bottom of the page: Ein Mann, kein Funk, kein Rückzug, one man, no radio, no retreat. The words chilled her. She spent months searching for the soldier's identity, piecing together fragments from German field rosters in civilian census records. The pattern pointed to one man missing from his unit in January 1945. Erich Meyer, a machinist from Leipzig. His service file ended that month. His body never found. It was enough. When she published her findings in a small academic journal, few noticed. But among military historians, the story resurfaced. The simplicity of it, one rifle, 3 days, an army delayed, carried more weight than any grand campaign. It was the human scale of war stripped bare. Not nations, not generals, just the persistence of a single will against inevitability. Years later, Lena visited Wittstock herself. The supermarket still stood on the old factory lot. She walked its aisles, tracing where the walls once rose, where the window might have been. Outside, the wind cut through the narrow street, whistling between the new buildings. For a moment she imagined it. The smoke, the silence, the shot that had split the morning. She realized then that the story wasn't about victory or defeat. It was about the terrifying precision of focus, the kind of endurance that lives only when everything else has already ended. When she left, she placed a single brass casing, recovered from the excavation site, on a low concrete step at the corner of the street. No plaque, no inscription, just metal and silence. The next day it was gone. Winter returned to Woodstock again, heavy and quiet. The new streetlights flickered in the fog, and snow gathered along the edges of the pavement where the old cobblestones still peeked through. To anyone walking past, it was an ordinary town. Rows of homes, the hum of cars, the sound of children running to school. Yet under the ground lay the traces of a battlefield, compressed beneath 70 years of peace. The earth still held iron and lead, the rusted fragments of a fight that had lasted 3 days and outlived everyone who witnessed it. By the 2000s, the story of the sniper had spread beyond historians. A British documentary on forgotten battles of the Eastern Front included a short segment titled The Phantom of Woodstock. The producers had only fragments to work with: photographs of ruins, Soviet reports, and one grainy image of a rifle found in 1945. Still, the tone was reverent, almost uneasy. The narrator's voice lingered on the words, "One man, 3 days, one street." Viewers remembered that phrase more than the war itself. For some, it was proof of what war really was, an accumulation of small impossibilities that made logic irrelevant. For others, it was legend, another wartime myth inflated by fear. Online forums filled with speculation. Some argued the sniper had help. Others claimed it was Soviet propaganda, designed to justify delays. But every skeptic who examined the data found the same anomaly: a 3-day halt in Soviet advance, recorded by both sides, centered on a street no longer visible on modern maps. The gap remained unexplained. In 2009, a team of German archaeologists began excavations near the old factory site during a redevelopment project. Beneath the concrete foundation, they found layers of brick and ash, metal scraps, melted glass, and dozens of empty rifle cartridges. Ballistics confirmed they were all fired from the same weapon. A small plaque was eventually placed near the site by the local historical society. It read simply, January 1945. A single soldier held this street. His name is unknown. His silence remains. No ceremony accompanied it. No flags, no speeches. The plaque became part of the wall, unnoticed by most who walked by. Yet every so often, flowers appeared beneath it. No one ever saw who left them. For military scholars, the event remained a paradox. The Woodstock sniper was not celebrated as a hero, nor condemned as an enemy. He became something else, a study in human endurance and perception. Tactical journals still referenced his methods, not for their lethality, but for their psychology. Training programs taught his principle without mentioning his name: control the enemy's imagination, and you control the battlefield. In the years that followed, the world would find new ways to wage invisible wars, through signal interference, misinformation, simulated threats. Each of them, in some way, traced back to that same logic born in a frozen factory. The illusion had outlived the man who invented it. By 2015, the plaque was replaced with a small stone marker after vandalism. It bore no inscription this time, only the faint etching of a rifle silhouette. The townspeople said little about it, but during harsh winters, when the streets emptied and the wind moved through the narrow alleys, those who passed late at night sometimes thought they heard it, the faint metallic click of a bolt sliding home. Then silence. In that moment, the town felt older than history itself. Time has almost erased the war from Woodstock. The town is small, quiet, surrounded by flat fields that stretch toward the horizon. The rebuilt street looks like any other. New facades, clean sidewalks, no trace of the factory that once stood there. Only those who know where to look can sense what lies beneath. The ground is uneven in places, as if something restless sleeps below the surface. Every winter, snow gathers the same way it did in 1945, softening the edges of the houses, muting sound until even footsteps vanish. In that silence, the story returns. Not through books or documentaries, but through the quiet intuition that some events refuse to die. The Wittstock sniper has no grave, no uniform, no descendants to carry his name, but he has something rarer: permanence through uncertainty. The official history never reconciled his existence. Soviet records listed the engagement as urban resistance of unknown scale. German records ended without mention. For decades, the event drifted between myth and fact, until both merged into something more enduring. The man's anonymity became his identity. He stood for every soldier who fought without witness, every act of defiance too small for history, but too large for memory to forget. His trick, the manipulation of sound, timing, and fear, would echo across generations. It became a foundation of modern military thought, an invisible thread woven into doctrines that never spoke his name. Strategists studying perception warfare cited him without realizing they were describing the mind of a machinist from Leipzig who once turned a ruined street into a labyrinth of illusion. The lesson he left was not about killing, it was about control, the power to command hesitation, to make an army doubt what it sees. His bullets ended lives, but his silence stopped movement. The true weapon was not his rifle, but the belief it created. 70 years later, that belief lingers. The locals call the street Die Stille Gasse, the silent lane. Some claim that on the coldest mornings, when fog covers the rooftops and frost settles on the window panes, you can still hear it, a faint metallic click, a sound too deliberate to be the wind. It comes once, then fades as if the air itself remembers. At the edge of town stands a small memorial stone, half buried in snow, engraved with words worn almost smooth by weather. One man, no radio, no retreat, nothing more, no rank, no nation, just the summary of an impossible act. 72 hours in which one person held an entire street, and in doing so, captured the imagination of generations. The story ends where it began: a rifle, a ruined street, a moment suspended in time. Everything else, the armies, the politics, the maps, has crumbled to dust. What remains is the silence, the kind that makes men stop and listen, and the understanding that somewhere within that silence, one heartbeat once changed the rhythm of war. And as long as winter returns to Wittstock, that rhythm will never fully fade. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.